Okay, hello everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to Humanities Lecture Series. My name is Aida Dargahi. I'm the director of Humanities Lecture Series, and I'm also professor of humanities here. The Humanities Lecture Series seeks to promote students and public interest in the humanistic aspect of our culture to understand ourselves as members of diverse communities, citizens of one nation, and constructive contributors to the ecosystem. Our public lectures and presentations may address enduring or emerging questions central to the arts and humanities, or questions arising from other disciplines to which the arts and humanities might speak. In pre-pandemic days, we had our presentations on campus. But now, as you see, we are doing it live via Zoom. Tonight, we're going to have a 45 minutes of lecture, followed by 15 minutes Q&A. Given to the size of participants, your microphones will be muted. Please type your questions and comments in the chat box. We have a dynamic speaker tonight, and it's my honor to introduce her to you. Dr. Shoba, Sharad, Rajgopal, is a professor of international feminist studies at Westfield State University in Massachusetts, where she works as a chair of the Department of Ethnic and Gender Studies, and teaches courses on gender, race, and sexuality. Her doctorate is in media studies from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Prior to her arrival in the United States, she worked for 7 years as broadcast journalist for the Indian TV networks based in Bombay, India. Her journalistic work focused on the struggle of women and indigenous people in the post-colonial nation state. And she has also done in-depth news reports for CNN International. As her work has been published widely in academic journals, as well as newspapers in the US and India. Without further ado, here is Dr. Rajgopal. The floor is yours. Please.
Thank you so much, Professor Dargahi. It is an honor to have been invited to speak to your college today. And thank you to you and to the guest lecture series of Foothill College. And thank you to all of you wonderful students. I'm looking at all of you, and all of you look just so beautiful. It is such an honor to speak to you today. And San Francisco just happens to be one of my favorite cities in the world. And I'm going to be speaking about that in connection with my talk and ethnic studies. So to start with, I'm going to share something with you. For the last few days, I have been rereading 2 of my favorite revisionist history books. And some of you may be familiar with those books. One of those books is by a very famous professor of Asian American Studies, the late, great Ronald Takaki, who was a professor at the University of Berkeley in California. And the other is Professor Howard Zinn, who was at the Boston University. Both of these very famous professors. And I'm going to quote from the book by Ronald Takaki, which is called A Different Mirror. And I would strongly recommend it to all of you. It's a history of multicultural America by Ronald Takaki. And I'm going to quote something he says about your state and, of course, later on, your city as well. So here it is. I'm going to quote this now. Dr. Takaki made an important statement about California. The face of our cultural future can be found on the western edge of the continent, he said. And he quotes another very great Mexican diplomat and scholar and writer called Carlos Fuentes, who some of you might be familiar with. So here it is. California, and especially Los Angeles, a gateway to both Asia and Latin America, poses the universal question of the coming century. How do we deal with the other? That's a question for you. How do we deal with the other? And this is a very important point because of all the immigration debates that are going on right now, right? Who is the other? When you as an American look at the other, what does that mean? What is our perception of the immigrant? And why is our perception of the immigrant, especially the immigrant of color, so loaded? Also, as one, do we see the other as one who has commonalities with us or one who is very different from us, one who we can have nothing in common with? And this is so fascinating because, as you all know, as we all know, the original inhabitants of this country were people of color, right? So when did the United States decide that it would become a white nation? Well, that decision was actually made a long time ago, soon after the founding of the United States. And I'm going to give you a specific quote from the formation of the new country. In 1790, the Naturalization Act was passed, declaring that only free white citizens could become naturalized citizens of the new nation of the United States of America. What does that mean? It means that both people of color and women would be left out. They could not become citizens, naturalized citizens. They would have to wage a long struggle before they succeeded in being seen, in becoming citizens, in being accepted as citizens. And all of you know that this year is actually the anniversary, the centenary of what? The 19th Amendment, which is when women were first granted the right to become citizens. But women also were granted this right only under certain conditions, which I shall talk about later. Okay, but going back to people of color not being able to become citizens, naturalized citizens. Why was that the case? And if that was the case, wouldn't you call it a white supremacist nation right at the beginning? Or would you not? This is a question that is hugely contentious right now. It's being discussed right now as we speak. I'm very happy also to be speaking to students from California in my first Zoom talk. Professor Dargahi, you will be interested to know that I have been on various panels, but because of my research, my current research is actually on South Asians and the Black Lives Matter movement. I have not been able to give any talks at any universities. But when you asked me, I could not say no. So, folks, and because you folks are from California, how can I say no to students from California and especially from San Francisco? Because I am the chair of the Department of Ethnic and Gender Studies. And where was ethnic studies born as a discipline? In your state, and in fact, in your city. Isn't that amazing? Just think about it. Both ethnic studies and women's studies were born of revolution. And in the case of ethnic studies, it was born of revolution waged by students like you. 50 years ago, the discipline did not exist. The discipline came into existence because of the determination of students like you who waged an unbelievably amazing and heroic struggle for 5 months, waging hunger strikes relays where they would relieve each other, and 5 long months, an arduous struggle, at the end of which, 1969, they were finally granted programs in ethnic studies, not gender studies. Women's studies and gender studies later on, which came up later on, were separate, right? So I'm talking specifically of ethnic studies. And all these areas, Asian American studies, African American studies, Latinx studies, Native American studies, all come under the umbrella of ethnic studies. And I shall quote from you a very important piece from a recent NPR report. They described this strike, which gave birth to the ethnic studies movement and departments, as the student strike that changed history in higher education. Imagine that. I am so proud of this amazing activism of young people like you, who never gave up, who were threatened, who faced enormous threats even to their future careers, but they didn't give up because they realized that they needed to fight for what was right, because only then could they transform academia, the face of academia, and the face of this country. And success. At the end of 5 long months, the administration gave in. This was both at San Francisco State and the University of California in Berkeley, right? And they acceded to the students' demands of creating ethnic studies programs, which later on became ethnic studies departments. And now you can even get a doctorate in ethnic studies, right? Whereas 50 years ago, none of this existed. It was considered radical to even take a course in non-Western history, right, of the United States. Anyway, let me come to the role of Asian Americans in that struggle. They played a key role in that struggle, along with other minority groups. You must remember that this was a time when people were there was a huge anti-war movement that was going on, right? And I'm talking specifically of the Vietnam War. And this is precisely what the great African-American poet Alice Walker said. Alice Walker, by the way, is the same Alice Walker who coined a term called womanist. And she coined it because she felt that African-American women were being marginalized by the mainstream feminist movement. So what did Alice Walker say? She made an important statement, and I quote from that statement. When asked whether California, especially with its multi-ethnic society, represented the America of the 21st century, she replied, "If that is not the future reality of the United States, there won't be any United States." What a powerful statement. Because that is who we are. The rest of the country has to look more like California, because that is what the country is, right? In essence. This is such an important right now because this inclusive vision of the nation is under a huge threat, faced with a huge backlash, the backlash of Eurocentrism and a cultural war that is very much in evidence in the elections right now. But I also want you to note that this is not going on only in this country. This cultural war is going on in many countries around the world. 2 years ago, I had been for a conference to Belgrade, the capital of what was once Yugoslavia, formerly the United Yugoslavia. So I had gone there for a theater conference, an academic conference. And from there, I traveled to Montenegro with my friend, who happens to be a Pakistani-American scholar. So we traveled to Montenegro and then to Croatia. And these were beautiful countries. Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia. We enjoyed ourselves immensely, but we also noted something extremely disturbing. We noticed that across Central Europe, there was the rise of fascist movements. And interestingly, these fascist movements were combined with the Orthodox Church. Isn't that interesting? And this is in parts of the world which had given up communism and which was supposedly becoming democratic. But the new democracy also embraced a very scary form of Christian extremism, whereby people who did not belong to that faith and that ethnicity and were people of color would be considered other. Very, very interesting, very disturbing. So, and this is the case not just in Central Europe, but also in other parts of the world. In India, my ancestral country, very much so. In Turkey, all these countries, the gates of each nation are being closed to the other. In fact, they call it Fortress Europe. That is what is coming into existence in Europe, which is being combated. People are not keeping quiet about this. They're fighting back. And a lot of the people who are fighting back, writers, filmmakers, activists of all kinds, and students, people of your generation, they are the ones who are most active in fighting against this non-inclusive view of their country. I'm now going to share with you photographs, 2 photographs, and I'm going to request Professor Dargahi to share these photographs with you. The first photograph is that of an immigrant family. This is a Sikh family that came to the United States in 1915, right? They immigrated to the United States. They were hoping to become citizens of the United States. And that is, you have here Vaishno Das Bagai and his wife, Kala Bagai, and their 3 sons, Brij, Ram, and Madan Bagai. This was taken around 1920 to 21. And now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about their story and why this photograph is so important. In fact, I would like to congratulate you too, because of something else that you in California have embarked upon. And I don't know if you've heard of this. I hope you have. And if you haven't, this is a good time for you to learn about it. In California, in fact, last month, September 19th of last month, the city of Berkeley voted to name a street after a South Asian immigrant called Kala Bagai. That was the lady you saw in the previous photograph, the lady with her sons and her husband. But here we go. But what they discovered was, first of all, when they came into the United States, they were overjoyed. They were longing to come to the new world, the new democratic country of the United States. But what happened when they came here? Here, I'm going to talk to you first, before I go into that, right, about what Asian American activists said about about the rationale that they used to justify the need to name a street after this Asian American immigrant right now. Why would we do that? So I'm going to quote from their statement. Why do we need a Kala Bagai way? Because Asian Americans have been in Berkeley for over a century and make up 20% of the city. Yet you would never know it if you saw the names on the streets, parks, and schools. As far as we know, there is not a single street in Berkeley named after an Asian American. Kala Bagai is exactly the right person for us to honor at this moment, because she was an Asian immigrant, a woman of color, and a member of a minority faith, Sikhism. So she represents critical segments of our community who have been deeply unrepresented in civic naming. So it would actually, this naming would, I'm putting it in quotes, counteract the profound whiteness of our streets. I'm quoting from them. They also said, as a survivor of local racism and federal anti-immigration policies, honoring Kala Bagai is a tribute to her resistance in the face of adversity and part of our reckoning with a very difficult past. The letter of support from Native Americans from the area too is important in this regard, because to whom did the land belong in the first place, right? So I quote from the letter of support from the Lisjan Ohlone tribal chief, Corina Gold, who wrote to the granddaughter of Kala Bagai, when the opportunity, within quotes, when the opportunity to participate in the Shattuck Avenue name change came up, the tribe wholeheartedly supported the name change to Kala Bagai Way, because we want to acknowledge that there have been and continue to be people who come to our territory who have faced and resisted oppression and whose stories should be lifted up and remembered. Very important point, right? So Kala Bagai's granddaughter, Rani Bagai, speaks about how when her grandparents arrived by steamship, and they came not through Ellis Island, that was what many of the European immigrants came, Ellis Island on the East Coast, which is where I am from, right? But they came from via Angel Island in San Francisco, off San Francisco, the coast of San Francisco, from what was then colonial India under the British. And when they arrived in the steamship, the city of San Francisco must have seemed galaxies away from the world that they had left behind, right? And then, while they were so filled with hope, you can imagine their shock when, after they had, with great difficulty, saved up and bought a house, and they tried to move into this house in Berkeley, what happened? Racist neighbors stood in front of that house, not permitting them to enter their own house. They did not give up. They started a shop, and they lived above the shop, in rooms above the shop, because they couldn't move into this house. Anyway, in 1921, the family joyfully celebrated something very important for them. Vaishno Das Bagai becoming a naturalized citizen. That's interesting. At that time, he could become a citizen. Now listen very carefully. They thought, now we are as American as anyone here. But this did not last long, because just 2 years later, in 1924, the US Supreme Court and federal policy nullified his citizenship due to Indians being recategorized as non-white. How fascinating. This dark moment, which had occurred in the lives of many Asian Americans, has not been highlighted sufficiently in most media reports on Asian Americans. I must do so now, because the blatant injustice has to be acknowledged. How can a nation grant an immigrant citizenship and then turn around 2 years later and they say, oops, sorry, you're the wrong color. We take it back. Wow. And here is another important point. This is outrageous and unconscionable, as the individual is then rendered stateless, belonging to no nation. Remember, they'd already given up their nationality in India, right? To take up this new citizenship. So now they had no nation. And if you belong to no nation, what happens to your property, my friends? And this is important for a capitalist nation like ours that values property. It means that your property no longer belongs to you. So Vaishno Das Bagai was not a citizen anymore. He was not allowed to own property and was forced to liquidate all his property, including his general store. What did the man do? Now comes the heartbreaking moment. Feeling trapped and betrayed, he went to San Jose alone on a business pretext, rented a room there, and took his own life. He left behind farewell letters to his wife and 3 sons, urging them to go on without him because he had to do this as a symbol of protest. And he sent a letter. He left a letter also addressed to the San Francisco Examiner, the newspaper, explaining that he was taking his life in protest. It is amazing that in the light of such a terrible tragedy, with no property, no husband, no nationality, and 3 small children to raise, the young widow refused to give up. I am in shock, folks. How many of us would be able to do this? As her granddaughter Rani Bagai writes proudly, Kala Bagai refused to be defined by this loss. She put her 3 sons through school and college, working very, very hard. She flouted her cultural norms by marrying again to another Indian activist and a graduate of UC Berkeley, Mahesh Chandra. She reinvented herself, attending night school, wearing Western dresses, and even learning tennis. And this really touched me. She had many close American friends. She never held it against American people what the government had done to her and her husband and their children. She had many close American friends and never went on a social visit without a gift box of candy. And she waited. After 20 years, 20 long years, in 1946, through the Loose Cellar Act signed by President Truman after World War II, she was finally granted the US citizenship that had been denied to her and her family for so long. Isn't this a great story, my friends? Now do you understand why it is so important for the city of Berkeley to have named a street after this woman? Professor Dargahi, would you be able to show us the other photograph of Kala Bagai with her 3 sons? Does that come up for you? Thank you, Katrina. I'm glad you thought it was an inspiring story. I was deeply inspired by it. Yes, there is the photograph of the children all grown up now. The mother, the single mother, had brought them up. Of course, she got married, remarried, but she brought them up through the sweat of her brow. And there they are, fine, upstanding young men. Beautiful woman. Okay. So thank you, Professor Dargahi. What does this awful story demonstrate? The fact that despite their long presence in the UK and the Americas, however hard they worked, however much they tried to assimilate, the mainstream perception of Asians in the West remains that of new arrivals. And their representation in mainstream cinema has for a long time played into this stereotype. Their racial uniform, I'm using a term that was coined by sociologist Robert Park back in 1913, their racial uniform coded onto their bodies, was coded into their bodies, be it in their ke, which was their braid, the braid of the early Chinese immigrants was called the ke, or the turban of the South Asians, made them appear permanent foreigners, culturally and even genetically incapable of becoming real Americans. I'm going to quote for another statement by another famous Asian American studies professor, Frank Wu and writer. Frank Wu. Wu said that they were incapable of becoming genetically incapable of becoming real Americans. To Frank Wu's statement, I add, not just racial bonds, but religious and cultural bonds to their homelands as well. Because unlike the European Americans, they were not Christian. They were Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu, and hence seen as unassimilable. Well, folks, I hope you are enjoying this story, this very difficult history, but very important history.
Of course, yeah.
I'm going to go on to talk to you about what Ronald Takaki, how he described these early immigrants. And I'm going to use a media studies perspective as a media studies theorist myself. Takaki refers to the sensationalist headlines in the US media. From the very first day, from the very first moment when they arrived, the press rushed to the docks to watch them disembark. And they watched these tall, dark, swarthy men wearing turbans. And what did they call them? They referred to them as the tide of turbans. And here, the tide of turbans. Think about it. As a media studies theorist, I'm very conscious of the use of language here. Because what does this phrase imply? The tide of turbans. It is a menacing new vision that threatened the nation by drowning it in a sea of brown. The tide is coming in, the tide of turbans is coming in to drown all of you and take away our white culture. That's what it implied, right? So this is from Takaki. Takaki refers to the tide of turbans. And the title of the news report, of course, refers to the unusual clothing and headgear of the new arrivals. And here's another interesting thing. They were predominantly Sikh. 2/3 of them were Sikh, right? Because it's the Sikhs who wore the turbans. And the remaining 1/3 was Muslim, with a few Hindus as well. And yet they were all categorized as Hindus. Interesting, huh? Anyway, and here comes another interesting point. Very few Americans are aware of the long history of racism and discrimination faced by South Asians in the Americas, or that they had, like African Americans, been denied full citizenship rights in this country until the 1960s and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Immigration Act. Until then, their position bears some similarity to that of African Americans in that, although they had never been enslaved, they too had been denied citizenship on the basis of their skin color. And here comes an odd thing. Originally, they were classified, this is actually quite funny in a very ironic fashion. They were classified as Caucasian, but not white. They were classified as, this is the term that was used in the United States Census, dark Caucasians, dark Caucasians. And when Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian man from the Punjab, sued in a very famous case, he sued he took it up to the Supreme Court, sorry, saying, if you consider me a Caucasian, then you should be granting me citizenship. What's the problem here? And that's when they said, oops, this is a problem. You're Caucasian, but you're the wrong color of Caucasian. You're dark Caucasian. Yes, I can see Nassim smiling. It's actually quite funny, isn't it? If you look at it, it's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And this is a Supreme Court decision, my friends. So the Naturalization Act of 1790, if you recall, I mentioned it right at the beginning, employed explicitly racial criteria limiting citizenship to free white persons, and not even all white persons, but only white persons who own property. So not even all white men, but only white men who owned property. Wow. Vijay Prashad, the famous cultural theorist Vijay Prashad, tells us how determined President Theodore Roosevelt was that the United States was to be a white man's land. And he had a meeting of with 4 members of Canada's members of parliament, right? He held this meeting in 1908. And what did he say at this meeting? He said, we have got to protect our working men. We have got to build up our Western civilization with our white civilization. We have to build up our Western country with our white civilization. And we must retain the power to say who shall or shall not come to our country. Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt made this incredible statement to Canadian members of parliament. As such, it is no surprise that South Asians were just left out. They may be working long hours, farming in the plantations, working very long hours with little rest. But not only were they not permitted to apply for citizenship, they were not allowed to marry American women. And here comes the point. If they could not marry American women, could they not bring their own wives from their homeland and children if they had any? No, they were not permitted that. Cannot bring your wife and child or children, nor can you marry an American woman. What the heck is this? It's one way of ensuring that you will be permanently an outsider and you won't be able to really settle in and build strong roots in this country. But South Asians manage. This is incredible that they managed to find all kinds of loopholes. And what is the loophole they found? They found that they couldn't marry white women, but hey, they could marry Mexican women. So they married Mexican women. These Mexican women and South Asian men worked on the farms together, fell in love, got married, and they found that they had many things in common, but some things, as in the matter of religion, were different too. So then what happened? But coming back to white women, white American women had at that time managed to get citizenship, right? American women got citizenship. And here again, I will divide it into, you may all have learned the racial categories, that Native Americans were the last to be granted citizenship, which is such a joke, in 1924, 4 years after white women were granted citizenship. Black women too were granted citizenship in 1920, along with white women. But when they went to vote, they found all kinds of problems coming up. And that is why there was the civil rights movement happened. All of you know about all that in the 1960s. But coming back to American women who had just been granted the right to citizenship in 1920, they were told, all right, you're citizens, but if you marry an Asian man, you will lose your citizenship. And this was actually enshrined in a law called the Cable Act. It was an actual act. Interesting. So these were actually very strong anti-miscegenation laws. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, miscegenation. It stands for the mingling of races, and that was banned. I wish I could ask you this question right now, but maybe when you're asking me questions, I will ask you that. Whether any of you know, when it was that these anti-miscegenation laws were finally dropped by the United States. Well, friends, they were actually dropped only in the 1960s, the late 1960s, by a very important case brought by a white man and his African-American wife. And they were called, this couple, very interestingly, were known as the Lovings. And the Supreme Court case was called the Lovings versus Virginia, which was basically, you might have heard about that, right? And there's this film also, a very beautiful film about this. So anyway, that was the time when the miscegenation laws were finally taken off the books. Until then, in certain states, it was accepted if you married somebody from another race, right? If a white person married somebody who was a person of color. But if you went down to the South, many of the southern states did not accept it. And you would be seen as having committed a crime. And your children, if you had any, would be considered bastards. This is very, very, very frightening. Think about it. So anyway, in all this time period, what has happened? The United States brought in a whole lot of acts which prevented Asians in particular from entering the United States. And these acts, right from the beginning of the 20th century, right, went on to the Barred Zone Act of 1917 and then the Immigration Act of 1924, whereby all Asians, with the exception of Filipinos, because Filipinos were considered wards of the United States because the Philippines was a colony of the United States. But all other Asians were not permitted to enter the United States anymore. And that is why, for a very long time, to see an Asian face in this country was kind of unusual. And that is why, for a long time, people thought, when they thought of an American, they thought of a white person, a blonde, blue-eyed person. That is the norm, right? Because all this time that Asians were kept out of the country for half a century, Europeans were pouring in from all the different European countries. So now you understand the significance of Kalabagai being granted this special honor of having a street named after her. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk to you about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how it pushed the next act, which is the Immigration Act of 1965. And I will go so far as to say that if the Civil Rights Act had not come into existence, pushed into existence by amazing activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then you would never have had you would never have had the Immigration Act of 1965. Because the Immigration Act of 1965, finally after half a century, threw open the gates of the United States to Asian people did. And Lorenzo, you're saying, thank God it did. And I'm so glad it did. Yes, I'm so glad too, right? But listen to me, this is an important point for you to think of. It didn't open the doors to immigration for all Asians, only of Asians who had a certain level of education. Not the huddled masses, as the famous poet put it, right? Who were desperately poor. No, you had to be a highly educated graduate to be accepted as an Asian into the United States. This was 1965. Anyway, many Asians came in at that time, taking advantage of this act. Okay, now I'm going to tell you another important story. And I'm going to ask Professor Dargahi whether she found a photograph of the Komagata Maru ship. Were you able to find it, Professor?
No, unfortunately, I couldn't. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's all right. Well, you'll have to bear with me because originally I had a video too, but we were not able to put the video up. The audio was not clear enough, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
the audio and the movements, it had delay and wouldn't deliver really well.
so I'll just tell you about it,
I
right?
put the link in the chat box. Later, students can go and just watch it in their spare time.
That's great. So, folks, I'm going to tell you about the year 2014. The year 2014 has been commemorated with great fanfare in Canada, of all places. What happened in 2014? Because it was a centenary after another incident that had happened. And that incident was called the Komagata Maru incident. The Komagata Maru was a Japanese liner that had been commissioned by an Indian Sikh businessman called Gurdeep Singh to sail to Canada, carrying 376 passengers, originally from the Punjab in northern India. Canadian newspapers screamed Hindu invasion of British Columbia when they arrived in Vancouver, although actually only 12 of the 376 were in fact Hindu. The majority of them were Sikh, with a small minority of Muslim, much as was the case with the tide of turbans when they arrived in San Francisco, right? But the passengers were not allowed to disembark, although the ship remained in harbor for 2 months. So just imagine, you're not allowed, you've had this long journey across the ocean, and then when you finally arrive at your destination, you're so eager, you're dying to get off, and start your new life. No, you're stopped in the harbor because Canada and the United States were at that time had formed a pact to keep people of color out. So the ship was finally, after 2 months in the harbor, with people starting to starve. There wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough water. It was a crisis. Finally, they were told, we will give you sufficient water and food, provided you promise to leave Canada and go back to India. Mind you, can you imagine how much they must have saved money to come all the way here to Canada? But without being permitted to disembark after their long journey and after being stuck in Vancouver Harbor for 2 months, back they had to go all the way to India. And then what happened when they arrived in India? This is unforgivable. They were seen as traitors because India at that time, India at that time was not an independent country. India belonged to who? To the British. And this is so ironic because the British were the people who the American colonists, the US colonists long ago had first tried to escape from. And now they were their great allies. And what did the British do? These passengers, the passengers of the Komagata Maru, who faced unimaginable hardships on their long voyage home, were met by the iron fist of British authorities upon their arrival in India. And many of them, 19 to be precise, were shot dead. That is the story of the Komagata Maru. And for all these years, Canada refused to apologize. Finally, in 2006, the Canadian government, under the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, finally acknowledged their racism, acknowledged it, but not in Parliament, at some other public event. But the South Asians were furious. They said, we are not going to accept this. This is no proper apology. We want a proper apology in Parliament. Well, my friends, that apology finally came only when a Democratic Prime Minister came into power. And that was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. There's the photograph of Justin Trudeau making his statement, making this important statement, making an apology. In 2016, this was in 2016, and you can see behind him, a turban, right? Because Justin Trudeau's government, he made it a point to bring in a number of Sikhs into his parliament. The defense minister of Canada, he appointed, was a Sikh. So he made this apology, this formal apology about the dreadful racism that his country had indulged in a century ago. And the Sikhs accepted his apology. And this entire shameful incident is currently being turned into a feature film, Exclusion, by Canadian South Asian filmmaker Deepa Mehta. Moving on now to another very important issue, important topic in this whole topic of South Asians and racial justice, and that is the Gadar movement. I hope you understand from this, from all these movements that I'm telling you, that South Asians were never passive victims. They fought back. They fought back. Sometimes they didn't get justice immediately, but that didn't stop them. Justice came perhaps to their grandchildren many years later. So the Gadar Party was a party that was created here again. Guess where? In California, in San Francisco, in 1913. Now you know why I admire you people so much. Your state of California, right? So the very word Gadar means mutiny or revolution. And the party drew inspiration for what has been termed in British history to this day as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. But in India, it is not called the Sepoy Mutiny. It is actually called the First War of Indian Independence. Think again, I'm going to bring a media studies theorist perspective here. And I want you to look at the word mutiny, right? The word mutiny, actually, does it sound like a word of strength? Or does it sound like you're doing something that's not quite right? You've heard of the book and the film Mutiny on the Bounty? Yes. And of course, in the United States too. Originally, when the colonies fought against Britain, it was considered a mutiny, not a real revolution. Okay? But of course, the Americans later on, they claimed, no, this is not a mutiny. This is a revolution. And again, it is so ironic that the US colonies, the original mutineers, had now joined forces with the former oppressors to deny other suppressed people their rights. Supremely ironic. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Gadar Party. 6 years ago, in 2013, the centenary of the Gadar Party was commemorated in India, as the movement had been launched, as you know, in California in 1913 by a group of revolutionaries led by a scholar and activist called Hardayal. And they were prepared to achieve their liberation, the liberation of India, that is, through revolution, if need be. They explained the purpose of their party in their newspaper, which was called Gadar. And I'm quoting from their newspaper. Today, in a foreign country, but in the language of our own country, we start a war against the British government, But of course, the United States at that time, being seen as a great ally of the British, saw this as a criminal act. Instead of supporting these people, the Gadar revolutionaries who wanted independence for India, they saw them as criminals. And they were persecuted. By the spring of 1914, the Gadar newspaper began to attract a huge following, with 5,000 copies being distributed on the Pacific coast, as well as in India and in diasporic Indian communities in Manila, in Yokohama, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, etc. But it was declared a seditious publication by Britain. And because Britain declared that, it was banned in Canada too. And postal authorities began to intercept its parcels. Interestingly, the Gadar Party was also an interfaith organization, for its early leaders included, of course, the Hindu founder Hardayal and 2 Sikhs and a Muslim. And the masthead of this publication bore the names of the gods of these three faiths: Ram, Allah, and Nanak. Nanak was not a god, but he was their first guru, the Sikhs' guru. And the majority of the members of the Gadar party were California's rural Sikh farmers. There is little doubt that the prejudice many Sikhs experienced in the United States fueled their passion for ending colonial oppression in India. Their exposure to both the ideals of American democracy and the realities of American racial discrimination gave energy to the movement. In all these cases, we can see how strongly and how bravely South Asians fought for social change. Now, I've been talking for a long time, and I think it's time for me to accept your questions, listen to your questions. So let me conclude by sharing with you an important point made. Again, I'm going back to the historian whose book I started with right at the beginning of this lecture, namely Ronald Takaki. Takaki said, "What we need today is a revisionist history grounded in unlearning, within quotes, unlearning much of what we have been told of our nation's past and substituting a more inclusive and accurate history of all the people of America." And this is the same point, the same credo of Howard Zinn. You might have heard of his famous book, The People's History of the United States, right? It was the first date book that my then boyfriend gave to me, now my husband. Yes, A People's History of the United States. And I thought, yeah, this is a cool guy. So the point that I'm making here is that both Howard Zinn and Ronald Takaki felt that instead of fearing and covering up and whitewashing our history, our country's history, with all its flaws, we must have the courage to build on our strengths as a great experiment of people from many lands, many religions, many races, coming together to build a new world. What a fabulous vision. What a wonderful, inclusive vision. What a vision that gives hope to people from the rest of the world. As Herman Melville observed a century ago, here again I quote, because Takaki quotes him, "You cannot spill a drop of American blood without spilling the blood of the whole world." Isn't that fabulous? You cannot spill a drop of American blood without spilling the blood of the whole world, because we are the world. Surely that is something that we can be proud of, rather than the regressive and Eurocentric visions of the leaders of an earlier era. That is my hope. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much. It's so fascinating and amazing. Thank you for sharing all these great stories and visions from great people. If you have any questions or comments, you may type in there and she'll respond to them.
Okay, I'm going to the chat section now. There's a comment by Nasim Ali. "All the stories you've shared this evening were also moving. Thank you for all of this insight on these issues." Thank you so much, Nasim. Really appreciate that. Henry Choi Freeman. Wow. Davita Edmondson. My goodness. Thank you so much for all your beautiful comments, folks. I'm just very, very touched. Do any of you have any additional questions?
There's a question.
Is there any questions on Muslim ban or Black Lives Matter? Yeah.
I may not be able to necessarily answer everything, but I'll try.
Let me see. There was a question. Let me find it about Muslim ban in the beginning.
Oh, okay. All right. This is from Karun Kaushik. "Is the effective ban of Muslim citizenship in India that was passed a few months ago an example of what you're talking about? I'm curious about your take on that matter, as it seems like a huge step backwards." Wow. you've answered the question, Karun. And you belong to the next generation. This is the future. You're looking at the future of India. India too, which had a very inclusive vision, like the United States. Now it seems to be taking another look, a step backwards, like you said, yes, a huge step backwards. Because we have to welcome people from everywhere. Here again, Karun, I'm going to make another important point. The Dalai Lama came to India way back before you or I or Professor Dargahi, before any of us were born, right? He came to India, he fled to India from Tibet in the late 1950s. And he came to India and sought protection, came over the mountains. And the Nehru government, the first prime minister of the government, which was then led by the Congress party, the first prime minister was Jawaharlal Nehru, gave him support and allowed him to live in India, him and his people, to live in India and start their own temples and have their own refugee communities, and even gave large pieces of land in different states of India. If you go and you look, you'll be very interested. You'll see beautiful Buddhist temples built by these former refugees from Tibet. And China was furious with India for doing that, for granting the Dalai Lama and his people refuge. But at that time, the Indian government said, it is our duty to accept, it is our duty to permit people from all faiths to enter our country because we are a secular nation. As such, would it be right to ban people from coming to the country just on the basis of their religion? I hope I was able to answer your question satisfactorily.
There is another question from Katrina and Amir after that.
Okay, let me see where the question is. Okay, Katrina. Aha. Thank you. I agree we have a lot to learn from our past, but we do have a pattern as a country to repeat ourselves. Do you think a future president will be issuing an apology for what is happening with children being separated at the border? Aha. A very important question. Well, I don't know. We don't know who is going to become the next president. So it depends on who is the next president for us to be seeing an apology. Yeah, thought-provoking. Next question is from Amir Tadros. Do you think it possible for us to supplement our current knowledge of our nation's history and culture with other more progressive viewpoints rather than forgetting what we've learned and learning the new perspective? Definitely, because I'd say it's important, because our past is not all bad. There were good things too that this country did. And we must not, an old expression that was used by my grandmother was, you shouldn't throw the baby out along with the bathwater. I don't know, you people are so young, I don't know if you have ever heard that expression. But you know what that means. The bathwater is dirty. So you're throwing out the dirty bathwater, but you shouldn't throw the baby out along with it. So you shouldn't say that this country is completely bad, completely horrible. There were some very beautiful and good things about it too. So we should learn the perspectives. So definitely we should supplement our current knowledge by learning the progressive viewpoints, because then you're learning different perspectives, and you have to learn different perspectives because that is what a democracy is all about. Okay.
And Phyllis has another question.
Okay, and thank you, Jesse, for your comment. Alice. And Karun, I'm glad that you felt that I responded to your question satisfactorily. Here's Phyllis's question. What do you believe to be long-term solutions to the racial prejudices and contentions that we are seeing right now within the country? Do you see these issues being resolved soon? I really enjoyed your talk, especially the anecdotes. Long-term solutions to racial prejudices. Well, one thing that we need to do we are talking so much about free elections, right? Voting, we should all be able to vote without being threatened, right? And have our vote taken away. But something else also needs to be done. And I criticize the Democrats here because they did not do enough about this. We need to have stop the use of electronic voting machines, because electronic voting machines are hackable. They are owned by private companies, right? And these private companies had promised to hand over Diebold, the company of Diebold had promised to hand over the elections to a certain party. I don't need to name the party. You folks all know it. Why did the Democrats not fight to stop the use of these electronic voting machines? So I would say that that's an important solution which nobody's talking about. It's really the elephant in the room. And it's also, we've got to use hand-counted votes, paper ballots. Like you're in Europe, Germany has started using hand-counted voting machines. Sorry, not voting machines, paper ballots. And many European countries have started doing that. Why are we not doing that? Why are we allowing our votes to be stolen like this? So our votes are being stolen by the Electoral College, right? By preventing people from voting fairly, by intimidating people at the voting booths, and by the use of these electronic voting machines. So folks, there's a lot that your generation in particular has to fight for. And I will say one thing more. I feel that young people are the ones who are the lifeblood of the nation, who are so passionate about bringing in social change. Don't you think it's important then for young people to be permitted to vote even at the age of 16? That's another issue that's coming up. Why wait till 18? Yet another issue. And here, Aden, question from Aden. A lot of progressive social media movements today seem to deride love of America as fundamentally favoring the status quo. Though you offer a different vision of inclusive patriotism, how would you respond to people who believe that our country's attitude is fundamentally and permanently broken?
And Aden added more to the previous question at the bottom.
Okay. What do you think is the difference between patriotism and nationalism? Very important questions. And I will give you just one statement here. I do not personally believe that our country is fundamentally and permanently broken. I do not think so. I believe with all my heart that it is possible to change, even at the stage. Come on, folks, think of what John Lewis said. Think of what Martin Luther King Jr. said when his people were suffering so terribly. He didn't give up hope, right? What did he say? We need to build the beloved community. And John Lewis said, how do we build that beloved community? By creating good trouble through revolution, not through violence, but by peaceful revolution, but by refusing to accept injustice. And you folks have the chance to do that. I hope I've answered your question, Aden. Yeah, I have hope. And finally, here's Hayden. There's obviously an appeal that the United States and regions like EU have for people from all over the world to want to go to these places. Inevitable for there to be friction when radically different cultures come together. How do the issues compare and contrast when it comes to immigrants in the EU versus the United States? This is another long question which I could talk about for a very long time. All I can say, lecture. Yeah, no time to talk about that now. So I will just say that there are a lot of similarities, right? But both in Europe, in the EU and the United States, I would say that you have to work at it. You can't give up. And the new citizens who come in, you have to help them to settle down. You have to help them with to learn the new language, right? To settle down, to understand the new culture. You have to have special programs for them. You can't just throw them in and say, okay, now assimilate. They won't. They'll be completely at sea and then they'll start getting angry and resentful. Okay. Any other questions, folks? That's it. Wow, you folks had interesting questions, which made me think. I hope you liked my responses. Okay, Professor Dargahi, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Rajgopal. We really learned a lot, and it was fascinating as the students are witnessing the anecdotes, and the stories are fascinating. And just, I think those stories remain with us for the rest of our lives, and that inspired us to learn more and go do more research on this topic. Thank you so much. I posted 2 links there, the videos she was talking about. So you may go and just copy that and watch those links yourselves. And this concludes our lecture right now. Thank you for your participation.
Let me add something here, Professor
Please.
Dargahi, if I
Yeah.
may, if you folks are interested. I'm right now co-editing a dossier along with a colleague from California, from one of the universities, Redlands College in California. And it's a dossier on the links between South Asians and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's a collection of articles and essays, including one by me and one by Dr. Jha. It's being published in the academic journal in the spring issue of the academic journal, the South Asian Journal of Popular Culture. I think you might be interested in checking that out. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
As we say in India, namaste, namaskaram. I send you off with peace and love. Many blessings.
Thank you so much. Thank you.